So welcome everybody, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you at this panel, which panel has a very specific topic, state, market, and migration from a Polanyian perspective, but you will see that there are going to be additional topics on this. Now, let me introduce this panel, and then for that, I would like to now to share the screen, and then you will see it. I hope now you can see my slides, and then this is the topic. Just a second, and now I'm trying to move to the next one. Just a second, it's just not moving. Just a second. Yes, here it is. So much about Karl Polanyi Research Center, which is, critical social studies, and then this is where you can actually get more information about it. It's not so important. Now we have a couple of very important speakers. First of all, it's a great pleasure to welcome Gareth Dale. Professor Dale teaches at politics at Brunel University. His most recent book is on Karl Polanyi's Political and Economic Thought, a critical guide, co-edited with Maria Markentenau and Chris Holmes. And then the title of his talk is going to be Marx, Polanyi, and Europe's Migration Crisis. Now, let me introduce the other persons as well before we go into the individual presentations, because it's on this slide. So it's a great pleasure to welcome also Professor Brunnbauer, who is the director of the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies. And he's also a chair of the history of Southeastern and Eastern Europe. Just a second, because I don't see my slides properly. Okay. History of Southeastern and Eastern Europe at the University of Regensburg in Germany since 2008. He has been doing PhD. He has a PhD in history from Graz and then from Free University of Berlin. He has had an enormous number of fellowships, Berkeley, Paris, Uppsala, Leicester, and Sofia. Extensive research has been conducted by him on Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Russia. And then there are a big number of recent books. He has come out with the Routledge Handbook of Southeast and East European History, edited together with John Lampe. Then the Geschichte Südosteuropas together with Klaus Buchenau. And very importantly, also globalizing Southeastern Europe, Emigrants, America, and the State since the 19th century. It came out in 2016. Okay, he concentrates on the history of Southeastern Europe since the 19th century with a focus on problems of migration, labor, family, and nation building. The title of his talk is going to be also, this topic is going to be extremely interesting as well. And then this is Socialism and the Vicissitudes of Opening Up, right? Now let's move on. The next speaker is coming from Greece, Aristotelian University. This is Professor Michael-Matsas. He is a writer, author of many books and articles on philosophy, political economy, and cultural studies in Greek, some of them translated into English, French, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese. Okay, and then in 2020-21, he has been lecturing in postgraduate programs in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Greece. And then his talk is the COVID-19 pandemic, global systemic breakdown, and migration crisis. Last but not least, we have a speaker from Budapest, Annamária Artner, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of World Economics. He also works at this, this is definitely not her choice that her university was renamed a couple of years ago, Milton Friedman University. Previously, it was named differently. He is an economist, senior research fellow at the Institute of World Economics and the Center for Economic and Regional Studies, and a college professor at the above-mentioned university. Her main research interests are the transformation of the world system, the global capital accumulation, labor markets, crises, and their socioeconomic consequences. Her recent publications are Some Iranian and Eastern Europe, a review of African political economy, Can China Lead the Change of the World, Third World Quarterly, Accumulation of Advantage and Elimination of Scarcity, a critique of the neoclassical approach, international critical thought. is unconditional basic income feasible in capitalism? It came out in Critique 2019, and then she published a very good book on Marx 200 in the year of 2018. Her talk is a little bit departing from migration. Will the COVID change the nature of capitalism? Now, with this, I am opening the floor to other speakers. And first, I would like to ask Professor Dale to give his talk. And then all speakers have 15 minutes. I'm trying to keep all 15 minutes intact. And in case you agree, then we collect questions at the very end to this. So with this, I give the floor to Gareth, and it's a great pleasure to have him. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Attila. I hope everyone can hear me. If you can't, just give me a nudge and I'll speak up. I wonder, by the way, what Polanyi would have made of Zoom meetings. I'm writing something at the moment, nothing to do with the talk here. It's on technological fetishism, and Polanyi was basically in the Rousseauian tradition, and sort of part of the argument being that humanity's technological capacities were rapidly outrunning its political and moral sort of maturity. So Polanyi was in this Rousseauian tradition. So he was something of a technology skeptic. But if there's one technology he loved, sorry, I shouldn't really begin my talk by a complete digression, but anyway, if there's one technology he loved, it was the telephone. And so I suspect Zoom meetings would have been quite to his liking as well. Anyway, I'm speaking on, this panel is on Polanyian perspectives on migration, I think. I'm not a Polanyian myself, I'm more a Polanyi fan or Polanyi obsessive. So I can't give you a Polanyian perspective, but I wonder what Polanyi's take on migration was, or on migration regimes. Migration regimes are, in other words, the political organization of migration. They're essentially a neo-colonial enterprise. By that I mean they center on the restricting of the mobility of the formerly colonized peoples and the facilitation of the mobility of the former colonizers. And in the process, the world's population is codified in terms of geographical location and race, so-called. So control of mobility has always been absolutely central to imperial control, and racism and migration regimes are central to that. A very good book on this, by the way, is Lucy Maeblin's book on, I forget the title, Asylum. What was Polanyi's take on migration? Well, first of all, we can refer to his, most of my work on Polanyi has been biographical, so I naturally start with the biographical. We can start with his personal experiences of migration and exile and refugees. So even as a very young child, he was aware through friendship circles of people providing shelter for political refugees from Russia, for example. Later in life, he was driven into exile, as I'm sure you know, several times, from Hungary to Austria, from Austria to Britain. And then he was prevented from living with his wife by a very restrictive US immigration regime. It's a complex story trying to recreate or to understand the specific reasons for Ilona's exclusion from the US, but it involved, part of the context was formed by the 1925 American immigration restriction, which had been driven by the US version of fascism in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and their friends in Congress. But then more specifically, by 1940s, acts and personnel and officials, McCarthyism that was beginning in the 1940s, really, and certain appointees of the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, including a very nasty guy called Breckinridge Long, a friend of Roosevelt, who was a very dyed-in-the-wool anti-Semite and admirer of Hitler. He played a very critical role in preventing undesirables from reaching the United States, so Jews and communists and so on. Anyway, Ilona was prevented from coming to the States to be with Polanyi, excuse me. Obviously, Polanyi's own Jewish heritage is relevant to the general argument here too. Isaac Deutscher once asked in his famous essay, The Non-Jewish Jew, why he wondered so many revolutionaries of modern political thought and of the revolutionaries of the intellect, why so many have been Jewish. And his answer was that it comes from living a life on the margins in the nooks and crannies of their nations. So it gives rise to a particular sensibility, which is very much alive to questions of social contradiction and social change. Much more recently, in a wonderful book called Racism, Class, and the Racialized Outsider, Satnam Verdi has extended this argument to racialized outsiders in general. He argues they're more likely to be attuned to the national and racial divisions through which capitalist power is constructed. And their sensibility, he argues, is foundational to an international socialist outlook. Was this Polanyi's outlook? To a degree, but not really, I would suggest. What were his experiences in this regard and his views here? Well, in his youth, he was Jewish in the cosmopolitan bourgeois manner. He was at home in multiple languages. He was easily able to tour around the empire and beyond. But at the same time, as a Jew, he was very much an oppressed, racialized outsider. So as a bourgeois, he was an insider in a sense. As a Jew, he was an outsider. And nowhere in Central and Eastern Europe were Jews more integrated and more secular than in Budapest. But it was also a destination for many Jews fleeing the pogroms of Tsarist Russia. How did Polanyi navigate this landscape? Well, he adopted a cosmopolitan mentality, as I've mentioned. But I don't think he really took it further to a radical internationalism that sees nation states as the political form of capitalism and the organizing form of xenophobia and racism, as I would see them. Instead, he aspired to membership of the Hungarian nation. He even volunteered to serve as an officer in the war in what I regard as the greatest mistake in his life. Although it had very interesting consequences for his understanding of the world. In short, he felt uncomfortable in both his national and his ethnic identities, but he tended to aspire to the former and to some extent to denigrate the latter, or quite often to denigrate the latter. So he was a sworn enemy of Hungarian chauvinism, but he maintained that the oppressed nationalities of the empire should be cohered under a greater Magyar hegemony. So he didn't support their right to secession. And we can be pretty certain that his ethnic and class milieu influenced his views on this. The assimilated Jews of Austria-Hungary formed a sort of Staatsvolk. They suffered oppression very egregiously, but through their Staatsvölkisch integration into the structures of empire, many of them found it quite hard to understand the gap between their dreams and aspirations and those of the oppressed nationalities within the empire. Why, they wondered, should Slovaks or Romanians not feel equally content with integration into the greater Hungarian cultural sphere? And a similar line of thinking applied to the Eastern so-called ghetto Jews coming in from the East. These were largely impoverished people. The authorities treated them appallingly. They arrived in Budapest hungry and dirty, and to the assimilated Jews of Polanyi's milieu, a number of different responses to these so-called ugly sisters from the East were possible. In one response, you could extend sympathy to them, to humanize them, in effect, to say, look at these people more closely. They're human, they're beautiful. A minority current was also a consistent anti-racism. That's saying the ugliness is not them, the ugliness is anti-Semitism. But the most common approach was for assimilated Jews to feel condescension towards them and almost disdain for their backwardness, for their distance from Western modernity. That the Jew in me would not be so ugly if it were not in them too. And this was a stance that internalized racism, partially accepted the image of oneself as Jew in the kind of circus mirrors of the prevailing anti-Semitism. And this was the prevalent view in Polanyi's milieu. His mentor, Oskar Jászai, was a key figure in disseminating the anti-Semitic fantasy that the Jewish question was a serious concern that had to be tackled. And in its essentials, Polanyi shared Jászai's outlook, and this influenced his rejection of his Jewish heritage. To Polanyi, these Eastern Jews appeared to be mulishly resistant to modernity and progress. To that extent, as a young guy, he was a liberal, classic liberal in his politics, but of course he was radicalized in the interwar period. Then in his writings from that period, from the 1930s, he wrote in one article in Mechanismen der Weltwirtschaftskrise, he implied that immigration control is somehow protective of society in this, counter-movement manner. The high standard of living of the United States in the interwar period, he writes, was partly due to two interventions which isolated. I'm coming to an end. Which isolated the United States from the effects of the crisis in the rest of the world. One was high external tariffs, so classic protectionism. Another was the closing of the door to immigration. Without these measures, he argued, poverty of Europe would have spread to the United States. Now, I don't find this very persuasive. Immigration controls aren't good protectors of living standards. Even as Polanyi was writing those lines, living standards in the United States were plummeting despite the immigration control of 1925. But was that Polanyi's argument? I don't think, I've been trying to reconstruct his views on racism and immigration. And I'm finding it a little bit of a struggle. So I'd be interested to hear your views. Sorry, I failed to come up with my goal, which was to identify a coherent argument on Polanyi's part. But if anyone can help me do so, I'd be very interested to hear. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I think that we will come back to some of these things, whether this protection against migrants is a double movement or not. This has been tantalizing some people. Now, with this, I give the floor to Professor Brunnbauer, and then once again, the talk is going to be, and I just repeat the title, Socialism and the Vicissitudes of Opening Up. The floor is yours, and then once again, 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Attila. I'm also not a Polanyian. I'm only a modest historian, so the only thing that I can do is to present the story. But as Attila has already mentioned, I have been doing some research on emigration from Southeastern Europe for the last couple of years, historical research, so far not using any kind of Polanyian perspective, but the invitation to this conference helped me to maybe reshape an argument that I tried to make about emigration and its impact on socialist Yugoslavia. On the last pages of the Great Transformation, and you all know better than me, Polanyi reflects about the conditions of freedom in a complex, and probably today we would say in a globalized world, in complex societies. And he's speaking about, well, he's envisioning a situation when we move beyond the market economy, and then the combination of meaningful economic cooperation and domestic freedom to organize national life according to the preferences of those national societies would be feasible. As we also know, the sort of first part of the equation, increasing economic cooperation or entanglement, did happen after 1945, but market capitalism did not disappear. Nevertheless, globalization until the end of state socialism did not involve only capitalist societies, but also non-capitalist ones, actually as important players in the global economy. I'm speaking about state socialist societies. Their effort to reshape global trade failed, so they had to engage with the global economy on capitalist premises. And my question here is, what did this actually mean for state socialist societies? The potential for fundamental tension was evident, and I think it can also be framed in Polanyian terms. What happens if societies in which the economy was not disembedded, but on the contrary was actually institutionally subjected to a high level of political control and intervention? If such economies trade or entangle exchange with capitalist economies, what happens to systems that are based on a strong idea of redistribution and ideologically committed to equality when they engage with capitalist business? In the last couple of years, there has been quite some research on global socialism or globalized socialism, and also the contribution of state socialism to globalization. One notable book is the one by Besnik Pula on globalization under and after socialism, who highlights the tensions between the global engagement of socialist economists and their domestic institutional arrangements. And basically his argument is that socialist societies structurally were incapable of mediating the pressures coming from outside, despite all kinds of policy reforms that were triggered by engagement with economic engagement with the West. Just to mention one example, central planning was not aligning very well with international trade. I will narrow down my argument to the case of Yugoslavia, which in many ways was a very idiosyncratic socialist country, but socialist it was, one party state with restrictions on private property and the market, at least notionally committed to equality and development. As we also know, Yugoslavia was probably the most open socialist economy out of expediency initially, because of the necessity to find new partners after its break with the Soviet Union in 1948. The question then is, what actually happened on the domestic side, on the side of Yugoslavia, when it began to trade and also to take loans from the capitalist West? That this was a potentially difficult relationship was highlighted already by contemporaries, and also recent research like Vladimir Jankovsky-Korica, an economic historian, highlighted that external entanglement, economic entanglement, created pressures and tensions that the Yugoslav political system ultimately could not digest. And he would, Unkowski-Koalica, argue that Yugoslavia's economic opening up also contributed to its dissolution, not because of some sort of Western conspiracy, but because of the domestic institutional arrangements and also the structural blocks for what you might call reform or restructuring of the Yugoslav socialist economy. And I think that labor migration played an important role in this story, and that's what I'm going to speak about in the next 10 minutes. I mean, I assume that that the basics of the Yugoslav Gastarbeiter experience are well known. Here, Yugoslavia being the only country that opened its borders for its citizens to take work abroad, and very many of them did so by the early 1970s. More than 1 million Yugoslav citizens lived and worked abroad, which was basically a fifth of total employment of Yugoslavia. So every fifth employed Yugoslav worked abroad, most of them, 2/3 of them in West Germany. For the Yugoslav government opening up and allowing labor migration, out-migration, was a kind of a spatial fix for its economic woes. In the early 1960s, the Yugoslav government implemented market-oriented reforms, which actually were a response to the pressures coming from its increasing engagement, economic engagement, trade with the West, and also of its attempt to pursue an export-led development strategy. These reforms in the early 1960s, market-oriented, led to rising unemployment in Yugoslavia. And by opening up its borders for labor migrants, the government hoped to export basically unemployment. And it also thought that that labor migration would have some nice other positive collateral effects, like, for example, financial inflows from migrants, which did happen. So remittances from Yugoslav Gastarbeiters became the most important source of foreign income for Yugoslavia in the 1970s and early 1980s. Out-migration was thought to be a temporary fix. So the government obviously hoped that after a couple of years, the Yugoslav economy would start creating enough jobs again to employ people domestically. The government also hoped that it would be able to steer and control this process, but eventually it became pretty clear that the migration process from Yugoslavia was shaped by the demands of foreign governments and also foreign employers, and obviously by the actions of the migrants. Overall, I will argue that labor migration from Yugoslavia contributed to the growing domestic tensions in Yugoslavia and the erosion of the legitimacy of the state and obviously also of communist rule. The question is why, and why actually should we bother talking about a state that is not anymore? Because I do think that we can learn some lessons, what it means, what kinds of pressures are generated for domestic political systems by massive immigration. As we all know, the migration debate is usually obsessed with immigration, and right-wing forces, not only they, presenting immigration as a problem. But if we frame migration as a problem, then we should probably look at the sending states for whom immigration indeed can be a problem. And the problem in the case of Yugoslavia was not only the unintended economic consequences, for example, migrants not returning, then even generating in some areas of Yugoslavia a lack of skilled labor, but the public perception of emigration. Immigration was so massive that it was obviously a theme that was very prominently represented in all kinds of public media in Yugoslavia, and it also became a topic for social critique. One of the best Yugoslav directors, for example, Kristo Papić, made two, and the first one is shown here in stills, documentary films about the Gastarbeiter experience. One from 1968, Hallo München, really shows the Gastarbeiter migration as something that contributes to, or that is linked to alienation, that is linked to some important conflicts and tensions in Yugoslavia, or at least things that about which the government was really obsessed, like the tension between modernity and tradition, between city and village, between memory and present, about the temptations of consumerism. So in a way, migration encapsulated all the basic problems that Yugoslavia faced. Or another example from the same year, 1968, Yugoslavia experienced also massive student protests, and one of the slogans or one of the problems that students addressed, and they articulated the left-wing critique of really actually existing socialism in Yugoslavia, and this critique was obviously much more feared than any other critique by a communist government. And one of the things they criticized was were the market-oriented reforms by the government and the need for so many Yugoslav workers to take a job abroad. So just to mention two slogans which you could hear on demonstrations in Belgrade in 1968. We want employment in our country. We don't want to go for work to Sweden, for example. Or another proclamation read, it hurts us that thousands of our people must go abroad to serve and work for global capital. And this tension runs through also press reporting. Newspapers were not free in Yugoslavia, certainly not in the 1970s, where press freedom was restricted pretty much, actually. But there was a constant stream of reports about Gastarbeiters, and just by reporting about their problems, about the inability, also impotence of the Yugoslav government to protect the social rights of Gastarbeiters, also reporting about problems, people not returning, or if they return, not finding a job in Yugoslavia. This massive sort of discourse in Yugoslavia in the 70s and 80s about labor migration. Yes.
Basically 2.5 minutes left. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Just made evident that obviously the Yugoslav regime could not live up to its lofty promises, and that people voted with their feet, and that those people who notionally or officially remained part of the Yugoslav working class were actually let down by their government. So to wrap up, and to also at least I think you can find it on YouTube, another wonderful film by the same director on the trains that brought Yugoslav Gastarbeiters from Zagreb, from Yugoslavia to Munich, and showing really how they became numbers, how they became a product, a commodity that Yugoslavia thought to export. And that's my second reference to Polanyi, because one of its axiomatic assumptions was that no human society would tolerate human beings to be reduced to commodity status, and in case this happens, a counter movement will take place. And Yugoslavia experienced this kind of counter movement in form of nationalist policies, which very much talked about taking back control, and which framed social problems in an ethno-nationalist language, which resonated with probably not the majority, but with enough people to destroy the country and ultimately lead Yugoslavia into war. And so I think the general argument is that the southern periphery of Europe served as a convenient spatial fix for West European economies in the 1950s and 1960s, when they experienced a huge demand of labor, which they could not satisfy with domestic sources anymore. But the inverse relationship is not true. Socialism, at least to some extent, did need to engage with capitalism for its own economic survival, but this medication became lethal. Yeah, I think I can stop here, and it's up for discussion what this means, this short story for a discussion of the inequality of migration and its very unequal geography in contemporary Europe. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I'm sure that a lot of questions have already been raised. And actually, I'm just saying that, of course, there is no clear-cut Polanyian thing, but actually, I think we are touching some of the most crucial things, and then now including emigration and socialism and emigration as an experience into this debate. I think it's super important to continue the discussions after the talks. But here comes the next talk given by Professor Michael-Matsas, and then this is going to be COVID-19 pandemic, global systemic breakdown, and migration crisis. And then let's listen to somebody who is watching this very closely in Greece. So the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to everybody. So the eruption of the COVID-19 pandemic last year is definitely a dramatic turning point in world history. 1 year later, despite the early discovery of vaccines, the pandemic continues to spread death and social devastation all over the world. 1 year after, we have a lot of experiences of the mismanagement. It's huge humanitarian crisis by nearly all capitalist governments all over the world. We see the health systems in every country, particularly in Europe, to collapse under the burden of the pandemic, and the devastation in the health systems already done by privatizations and neoliberal policies in the previous period. We saw the mismanagement of vaccination itself created really a chaos, particularly in Europe, in the European Union, and then, Latin America is a hell on this issue. And during this year, we saw also that inequalities, social inequalities, were deepened, became broadened. We are not all equal in front of disease and in front of death. The most vulnerable sections of the populations, workers, unemployed, socially excluded people, minorities, and above all, this increasing multitude of migrants and refugees desperately struggling for survival were terribly hit by the pandemic. But in a deeper level, we can see that it's not just a problem of mismanagement. What emerges out of all these multiple manifestations of the universal tragedy is the historical incompatibility, market organization of society with the most direct and the most urgent needs of the actual life process itself. The pandemic catastrophe is not a natural disaster like an asteroid coming from the outer space hitting Earth, but nor it is not just a political construct in technology of power, just to manipulate populations. On the contrary, you have to go deeper to show the the metabolism between the social metabolism between nature and human beings, the human society, how it is affected by capitalism, and particularly by capitalist globalization of the last 40 years. And epidemiologists like famous work by Robert Wallace and his team had shown that from the onwards we have an epidemic of epidemics with the globalization of capital and the destruction of natural environment caused by it, the breakup of ecosystems and of immunological barriers. All we have one pandemic, one epidemic after the epidemic up to this one, which unfortunately it cannot be the last one. Capital is well known. He spoke about this metabolism between nature and human society and how it is affected by the development of a capital relation. And Polanyi, in his magnum opus, the Great Transformation, he grasped and he brought in light that all the cataclysms of our epoch, of the last century, the two world wars, the Great Depression, fascism, are the product of the collapse of liberal civilization and the utopia, the liberal utopia or dystopia rather, for a self-regulating market coming to embed society, social relations on economy. Even after the war in 1947, Polanyi warned again against what he called our obsolete market mentality. He reminded that labor is only another name for life activity of human beings, and land is nature. I quote, "The commodity fiction handed over the fate of man and nature to the play of an automaton running in its own grooves and governed. The market mechanism became determinative for the life of the body social. Nowadays, this Polanyian automaton has rich dimensions, and this globalized market mechanism not only dysfunctions, but became a major threat to life itself." The last 40 years, characterized by this, what was called the neoliberal capital or finance capital globalization, did not resolve the contradictions of the system. On the contrary, globalized the inner contradictions of capital itself. In a matter of fact, this capitalist globalization, it was an attempt to resolve to the crisis after the collapse of the post-war Bretton Woods settlement, the Keynesian expansion, which tied to it. And through different shocks, we arrived at the end of this period in 2008 debacle, followed by the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. The ruins of Lehman Brothers became the symbolic tomb of the failed neoliberal strategy of a system in decline. So the last 10 years, just before the pandemic, from the post-Lehman Brothers period until last year, all the central banks and central governments, the states, intervened with heterodox programs in a holding operation to prevent the collapse and to give by austerity measures all the burden of this crisis to be paid by the popular strata and the most weak sections. But already on the eve of the pandemic, it was clear that all these attempts failed, that we were on the point to end in a new, deeper, worst phase of the same crisis. And then came the COVID-19, which not only compounded the crisis, all the inherited unresolved problems, but also produced a qualitative leap, a totally changed world situation. This systemic, the global systemic process of collapse of a system, of this neoliberal dystopia of self-regulating markets all over the world, lead now to a breakdown with unprecedented economic, social, political, and geopolitical implications. The turbulent transition itself towards a post-COVID world remains no less obscure than the outcome. 1 year now, we see extraordinary state and central banks interventions to an economy plunging into the abyss. But everybody understands this is very temporary. Claims that what we had experienced last year, this year, the closing of national borders, the lockdowns, the disruption of the global supply chains, of travel, etc., that it marks the end of globalization. I think it's a very impressionistic, baseless, because, of course, all the myths associated with the neoliberal ideology of globalization received an enormous, fatal, probably, blow. But the global interconnectedness of the world economy, politics, cultures, etc., in all their diversities, is not abolished. The combined and uneven development of global capitalism did not end in 2020 or 2021. The pandemic itself shows that in a global solution. No social formation, no nation state, no particular sphere of social life in all their specificities cannot escape from a common predicament of humanity in the 21st century. The same people who say that the globalization has ended because of the pandemic, etc., they say that the migration, as we knew it in the years of globalization, and we make the globalization to be called the age of migration. 10 years, in the last decade, we have a 400% increase in migration on the population of displaced people, both within their country and abroad. This created a new, terrible situation. The European Union had transformed itself to a fortress Europe, trying to preventing all these desperate people who were victims themselves of the global north to coming to the non-promised land, and were condemned to be drowned in the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea. So last year, on the eve of the pandemic, in the so-called European Union border, which means the border, we had a very important development. The mass of the immigration, particularly from Syria and trapped in the civil war, etc. While in 2015, we have more than 1.5 million of people coming through the Turkish-Greek border to Europe. And then after 2016 and the European Union Turkish deal, they were stopped, they were trapped against their will, 75,000 of immigrants and the refugees in Greece. And they knew all the hell of what is really concentration camps and they called centers of reception for refugees and migrants and asylum seekers, etc. So last year, on the eve of the COVID pandemic, you had an exacerbation of this migration crisis in the frontiers of frontiers Europe. When Turkey, the Turkish regime which was involved in the Syrian tragedy, in the 27th of February 2020, received a huge blow in Idlib, Syria. So in the same day, they announced that the European Union don't follow the deal of 2016. So they opened the road for the migrants and the refugees to come in Europe via the Greek-Turkish border, particularly the Evros River. That created a huge crisis. It was clear that the refugee problem was weaponized. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. Okay. I will
finish the sentence and then
I will.
Sorry. Yes.
Not take much more time. And only the beginning of the pandemic had eased temporarily this crisis. I think this is not just a problem for countries like Greece or Turkey under their reactionary regimes, but it's a paradigm what happens in the pandemic, during the pandemic and after that, for all the refugee and migrants populations all over the world. Take one example before I finish. The United States, under the Biden administration, that some in the left, they consider it to be a kind of social democratic government. Despite the recovery plans and the trillions of dollars for directed mainly to the capital markets and for survival of capitalism, how the refugees and the migrants in the US-Mexico borders, what hell are facing there. Even a few days before, the White House said that they will keep the number of refugees coming to the United States in the lowest level left by Trump. Then under the protests, it said, okay, in 1 month we will reconsider our migrant policy. But I wanted to insist that the age of migration has not ended yet. And my final point, and I finish, returning, that undoubtedly the millions of migrants and refugees are the most vulnerable section in today's world. And to quote again Polanyi, poverty not only is a lack of goods, but it's a lack of belonging as well. And it's a common feature not only for the migrants, but also for the local populations. As a slogan of the movement of solidarity for migrants in Greece says, in the word of the bosses, we are all strangers. And then we have to keep in mind a point about raised also by Michael-Matsas about the 4 components of freedom, according to Polanyi. It distinguishes Polanyi's conception from the liberal conception. It is that freedom is, first of all, freedom as solidarity. Without it, there is no democratic freedom, no substantial freedom to seek a fulfilling life. There is no social freedom, fighting with all mass mobilizations, driving the movement beyond the present marketized society, collapsing into barbarism, to go beyond the market, beyond the state, to achieve what Karl Marx has called universal human emancipation, what socialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for this very, very exciting talk. And now I can see that even anti-migration and migration, is it a double movement? Can it be a double movement both sides, right? So that's actually, it's boiling up this question. Very good. Now with this, I give the floor to our last speaker, and then Professor Artner. She's going to talk about will the COVID change the nature of capitalism, right? So I think after the talk of Professor Matsas, I think you also have to say something about this thing. Thank you very much. So the floor is yours, and 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So my topic is, yes, will the COVID-19 pandemic change the nature of capitalism? So, introduction. Due to the increased activity of the government during the COVID-19 pandemic, the hope that capitalism must, can, and will be reformed or humanized has strengthened. We could say, using Polanyian terms, that the pandemic has strengthened the counter-movement aiming at the reunification of the economy and society by the re-embedment of the economy into the society. This turn should appear on both national and international level. First, the increase of the healthcare expenditures has led many to believe that the capitalist state would take a more labor-friendly approach in the future, as it did in the era of the welfare states before the neoliberal turn. Second, as the pandemic affects many countries and its treatment demands common and global approach, so the possibility and the need for an intensification of the international cooperation of capitalist states in healthcare might seem possible. I think, however, that these expectations are naive. First, the management of the crisis hasn't gone beyond the already existed measures. Increased government spending and lowering tax burdens in the most effective fields of the socio-economic space. Second, the measures haven't been enough quick and sufficient to prevent the economic crisis. Third, the foundations of capitalism have remained untouched. There is no intention to change the basic mechanisms and institutions of capitalism, to change particularly the private ownership of the means of production. Fourth, the health and social protection measures are not applied properly in relation to migrant workers. I refer here to the case of the Tönnies slaughter in North Rhine-Westphalia. Discussion. How do capitalist governments behave in COVID-19 crisis? First, in general, the capitalist governments are not prepared to any crisis. They cannot recognize when a crisis is approaching. They usually underestimate the magnitude of the crisis in the beginning and begin to cure it only with a considerable delay and with inadequate measures. This is because capitalism is an anarchical system of production based on market competition between isolated producers. Even the companies themselves are not able to see the results of their production before throwing their products on the market. So my first conclusion, because of the overall isolation of and fragmentation of the productive forces by ownership, the socio-economic life of capitalism is not planned and cannot be planned. It follows the conclusion number 2. Even if a capitalist government prepares a strategic plan, the private companies cannot be forced to follow it. This problem of the impossibility to command the production in capitalism appears at both national and international levels. For example, the difference between China and the fully capitalist countries is apparent in curing the COVID-19 pandemic. China ordered full lockdowns and restrictions in the affected region 23 days after the new pneumonia disease had been identified. The drastic measures stopped the spread of the virus within 2 months and could eliminate the pandemic by August 2020, 8 months. China lost only less than 5,000 lives. The success of the government measures made clear that the population trusts in their leaders. This trust is rooted in the unhesitating, determined, and firm action of the government. The Chinese government could react so because it has a well-structured, comprehensive, hierarchical emergency response plan, what you see in figure 1, with a state plan on the top of it. The system is based on a 1 planning plus 3 systems, That means the plan is built upon the legislative, institutional, and regulatory systems and integrates them. Besides, there are strong social mobilization in case of emergencies in China. The strong social support from grassroots NGOs, charitable and local community organizations, private enterprises, and the public in general has considerably contributed to the efficiency of the management of disasters by providing valuable frontline support to the people. We do not see any similar phenomena in the capitalist world. The international system of alarming is already relatively developed thanks to the international health regulations of the World Health Organization in 2005, and the European Union has reacted relatively quickly. Despite these, the first national restrictions in Europe were ordered on 8 March in Italy, 36 days after the first case had been detected in Europe in France, although by that time the experiences of China were already known. Furthermore, in Europe, after the first wave of pandemic, the reopening of the economy was too fast and resulted in a quick increase of the cases and deaths. The European Commission cannot prepare a strategic plan that would be compulsory for the member states, and the mobilization of the population is also more difficult. The European citizens' trust in the leadership of Europe is declining, as you see in Figure 2. The European Commission issues alarms and roadmaps, but has neither power nor intention to force the governments to follow the guidelines. Example, in 2005, the Commission issued a technical guidance concerning the preparedness planning to improve the coordination of actions of member states against pandemics, and this document has been updated a couple of times since then. Based on the guidelines of the UN and the WHO, the EU member states have updated their preparedness plan after 2005. However, many member states haven't updated it regularly. For example, Hungary's pandemic preparedness plan was last updated 12 years ago. Also, the institutional structure on which the plan has been originally built changed substantially in the last decade. The superiority of the Chinese policy based on the hierarchical planning and the involvement of the population has been proved not only by the much lower number of fatal cases, but also by the much smaller impact of the pandemic and its treatment of the economy and society. China enjoyed a quick recovery and grew already in the first half of 2020, while Europe contracted by over 70% in 2020 as a whole. Conclusion number 3. The capitalist state institutions are incapable, and international institutions are even less capable of quick and sufficient response to any social, economic, or health problems. Conclusion number 4. The plan-based management of the society, particularly if it is promoted by the population, is more efficient than the private property and competition-based market economy. Here the question arises. Can we expect a turn away from the private property and competition-based society as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic? It doesn't seem likely. There are no signs that the European governments would move towards a more conscious and pro-working people management of the economy. Neither the EU Commission nor any government in Europe have thought of commanding the pharmaceutical companies to make the know-hows of the vaccines and the medicines open access, although this could have accelerated the production and saved thousands of lives. It also could have decreased the unit costs of production and eliminated the profits that the society must pay for the private production of the vaccines and other medicines. The private property and the right to accumulate wealth for the detriment of the society is inviolable and sacrosanct. The European governments have injected through the European Union a huge amount of money into the development and production of vaccines. However, it would be a mistake to think that this money serves the people. Instead, it serves amplifying capitalism through financing private companies. Examples. A big amount of money was spent to the advanced purchase agreement with Pfizer, the US, and BioNTech, Germany, to produce vaccines. As a result, the revenue of BioNTech has quadrupled and its profit soared. Even if the profits of the pharmaceutical companies hadn't increased in the short run, and this is a case in AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, they promised to sell their vaccines on a not-for-profit basis, these companies will surely benefit on the long run from possessing the technology and gaining a good reputation. The innovations became the private property of these commercial organizations, and they can later profit from them. Conclusion number 5, the capitalist state cures the crisis by feeding the capital. So any counter-movement that would demand state intervention against market forces results in measures that eventually strengthen the capital, that is, amplify market forces. As figure 3 shows, in the last decades, the government expenditures increased relative to the GDP around the world, mainly in the more developed high and upper middle income countries, and the global inequality increased in this field as well. The next figure shows that this is about Europe. We see that the national government health expenditures have increased in the last 2 decades due to the SARS and N1H1 pandemics, although the expenditures have declined after both events. The shares of health expenditures declined also because of the austerity policies after the 2008 crisis. So conclusion number 6. The management of health systems are just as much subjugated to the market imperatives, the cost-revenue paradigm, as other sectors of the production. The efficiency is not measured in human life or in working time, but in money. This logic limits the actions of the capitalist government. And in summary, first, the state intervenes in any crisis to save the capital, and only in such a way that doesn't hurt the capital. A durable re-centralization of the socio-economic life is contradictory to the interests of the capital. The only exception is when the increased centralization serves higher rate of exploitation. Even in that case, the freedom of market forces that allow capital accumulation are maintained. For this, despite the state interventions and the COVID-19 that the COVID-19 has brought about, we cannot expect a durable re-centralization that would serve the interest of the working classes. Second, since 2002, the international cooperation regarding health emergencies has been developed, but has been limited to the share of information. Third, the financial help to poorer countries will function as usual, as a means of influence and greater dependence. Therefore, it is of crucial importance which country supplies vaccines to whom. In our age of a new Cold War, besides trade wars, we can speak about a vaccine war. It is apparent if you think of the propaganda against the Russian and Chinese vaccines in Europe that is backed by the Eurocentric attitude of the European population. And lastly, fourth, so even if there is a coordination of the management of health crises on international level, which doesn't mean the sharing of the know-hows, we cannot expect an increase of the role of state in the public services or a comeback of the welfare state. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. And then, planning comes into this debate as well. So I think we have been listening to a very rich bulk of ideas and interpretative frameworks. And with this, I would like to open the floor. All people can write into the Q&A section, which are going to be read to the panelists. And then as soon as, then we will let it go like this. At the moment, I don't see any question emerging in the Q&A session. People are thinking. In the meantime, I would like to ask whether people the panelists would like to react to each other, because there was definite divergence in some of the perspectives. In case there is something, I open the floor for that as well. And if not, then I can, of course, come up with questions. So do the panelists would like to react onto each other's talk or to ask questions from each other? Okay. Nobody, everybody is okay. Then I would like to ask the floor. Yeah, Gareth, yes, the floor is absolutely yours. Yes.
Oh, okay. Just very briefly. Yeah, I really enjoyed the various talks. Especially, I mean, particularly Ulf's, because I'm currently writing a paper with Vlad, who you mentioned, and Savas's emphasis on migration as resistance. I mean, migration is obviously much more complex, but I could really relate to that. But I'd just like to throw in a disagreement with the final speaker, Annamária, yes, which is that I think it's, as I see it, I think it makes more sense to read the COVID crisis to read China as a form of capitalism, and the COVID crisis has emerged it's not a natural virus. It's a virus that has been created by capitalist conditions of rampant accumulation, deforestation, and so on. This is what drives the bats away from their normal habitats and into unusual places where they start, where the zoonotic spillover begins, which led to the COVID crisis. Certainly, China has then dealt with the crisis more effectively than many other countries, but not particularly more so than Taiwan or South Korea. I mean, there's an East Asian experience with SARS and other viruses, which has helped prepare East Asian countries better than some of the decrepit old capitalisms in the West, such as the preposterously poor and corrupt reaction of my own government here in Britain. These are very decaying forms of neoliberal capitalism, unlike the rising capitalisms of China and South Korea and Taiwan, which have been much, much more effective, partly because of their tradition of corralling capital, corralling businesses as part of the catch-up industrialization experience that they're part of. But the COVID crisis, I think, can be understood, and the pandemics which will surely come, can be understood as partly a consequence of rampant accumulation, capital accumulation, which is just tearing up the world. So it can be understood as part and parcel of the climate crisis which we're facing, and which China is contributing to through more than any other country through its frenzied building of coal-fired power stations, and it's ripping up of forests and so on. It's preparing the way, just as all other capitalist economies are, for the pandemics to come. And this is partly why we're seeing an acceleration in the production of zoonotic viral diseases, as we've been seeing in the last few decades. So it's not a question, just a disagreement, of the usual kind.
Okay, thank you very much for this comment. Of course, I give the floor to Annamária in case you would like to react to this, or that is not related to your argument. I'm just asking if yes, Annamária, yes, would you like to?
Well, I think I agree. I just used China as an example for an efficient treatment of the pandemic, which is not characteristic for Europe, which is not characteristic for the individualism and competition-based societies. And I think this was my message. And of course, China is on the way of accumulation, yes, on a path of development which has already passed by the developed European countries, and the developed European countries had also had pandemics before that in the age of the initial accumulation. And it is also true that the China also is one of the most rapidly expanding consumerism country, and well, we can say that. But nonetheless, I think that China and the government and the Communist Party can manage this, then can frame this development, and I think it is something which is much better than what happens in Europe concerning any kind of crisis, not only in case of pandemics or in case of the crisis of capital accumulation, but simply local social crises or unemployment or increasing inequalities and so on and so on. And therefore, I thought that it's important to think, to look at those examples, which are so far from it. And Attila knows better than me that how European we are and how this European way of thinking, Europeanness, Eurocentrism is ruling the European thoughts, and I think it's time to realize that Europe is far not the best in case of crisis management.
I think it's an important point. Planning capabilities, right? I think it's a very important point. Of course, it doesn't mean that Gareth is not correct, that some of the countries could actually, even regardless of capitalism, could intervene in a way solving some of the problems. But I think these differences should be analyzed very carefully. What were the other things? Also, very importantly, the economy of China is different because it's a kind of a mixed economy in quite a different ways, which also reacts differently, for instance, to problem of labor, problem of wage, and so on, all these things. So that, I think, for the next conferences, I think this is a great topic to talk about, and then to do real empirical analysis in that. I think that's very important. Now, can we go back? I don't see other questions. I'm encouraging everybody because these people have been listening to each other quite a lot already, and we would like to hear your voice, who can actually write questions to us, and then whether you would like to make comments or questions, you're more than welcome. But till the point you are doing this, I would like to come back to this issue of double movement and migration. And can I ask all the panelists concerning this? Because I just tried to collect. So Gareth raised the problem very rightly in a lot of ways that, let's say, anti-migrant nationalism can be also understood as some kind of a double movement in certain ways. Is it because of which perspective we take? Savas made an excellent talk, migration being as a double movement. So the uprootedness is somehow being handled by these migrants, and then they are actually making some kind of a double movement against global capitalism, which is doing this uprooting to them through wars, through the change of the economic structures and so on. And Ulf also made a very important point concerning emigration. How do we put emigration into this from the point of view of a society which was prepared to, which had some planning, which had planning and market. Nonetheless, it was sending out people, and then there was, the ideological tenet that the work is to be provided for people. So then how we can see that. And then I think also silently, Annamária made another comment with regard to this COVID and migration, and that was also related to the new conditions that maybe Yugoslavia could not protect fully the social rights of the Yugoslavian guest workers, but it's uncomparable with the situation now with these European workers For instance, what Annamária referred to, these, the meat production in Germany was producing a zillion number of COVID cases among East European workers, clandestinely during the night taken to Germany in order to continue the production mechanism. So I would like to come back this issue a little bit, and then people can make a comment to this double movement. Can we make a good use of that, or it's too complicated, and your advice would be that actually it's not the best way to understand it? So I would like to ask all panelists, in case they would like to react to this concern in this panel.
May I speak? Savas.
Yes. So yes, go ahead, please. I mean, yes, dear friend, yes, go ahead. Yes, please.
Yes, I think. Thank you for the comment, first of all, because this idea about migration as resistance and migration as a double movement which oppose the movement of world expansion of capital in its own way. It comes also from our study of the experience of the migrants in Greece, of course, who are not just victims. We have I think, a very Eurocentric or a global north attitude to see migrants only as victims. Of course, are victims, are the most vulnerable, etc., etc. They live in a hell. Okay, the last winter was terrible in Greece with snow, etc. And these people were in the karate camp without heating, without water, without medical services, kids, old people, without any protection. So of course they live in a hell. But why they prefer to face all this horror, if not to fight for their life, not just for survival? It is something more. I mean, I am a Marxist, and I think that there is a misconception among many Marxists. The central category for me, for Karl Marx, is not economy, it is life, what he calls Lebensprozess, the actual life process. This is the content of our social metabolism with nature. So this content is in a contradiction with the capitalist form, with the market itself, with the subordination of life to so-called economy. You remember this false dilemma during last year, proposed by all the governments. We have to give priority to life or to economy, or to balance between the two. I think if we see it from a Polanyian point of view, it is precisely what Polanyi condemned. I mean, to embed social relations to economy. And really the mismanagement by capitalist governments, particularly in Europe, but also in America under Trump, Brazil under Bolsonaro, etc., etc. All of this mismanagement, it is because they want to subordinate the demands for life to the demands for their capitalist market economy, which is in big trouble, and they cannot really, there is in a process of breakdown. So I think that the migrants are, as to use a term by Alain Badiou, they are a nomadic proletariat. From one sense, they are nomads fighting for life. At the same time, there is a revolutionary potential among the migrant communities, but it can be actualized only by solidarity, by building a solidarity bond, because both migrants and us, all the victims of this system, were on the same boat. They both looks like Titanic today, but we cannot save our lives, but only together. For this reason, there is a double movement in relation if the nationalist, fascist, far-right reaction is also has to be considered as a double movement. I read recently a comment by Joseph Burris, and who said that this kind is not a movement; it's an attempt by all these elites, the ruling elites, to demobilize people. It is to stop a movement. The far right. I mean, if you in Greece, for example, when it was last year, this crisis in the Greek-Turkish border, the government and the state mobilized not only the police, the army, and of course the European Union Frontex, but also fascist gangs of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah.
So,
excuse me, Savas, the problem is that our technical workers are saying that soon we have to close the panel.
Okay, this is the comment.
No, actually, no, you answered the question. Absolutely, you answered the question, although I would say that one of the key sociological issues, of course, is the lack of solidarity, right? Across various groups, which goes back, the classic 19th century, early 20th century. There was so much writing about, at that time they called it social chauvinism, right? That was the key term. So this issue of solidarity and the lack of that. Is there anybody else among the panelists who would like to react very quickly to these questions or not?
I'll just react incredibly, just very, very quickly. As you know, Attila, I don't personally think the double movement is the greatest of Polanyi's concepts. Yes. I'm a little bit of a maverick on this. I think it's an impressive architecture of argument, a beautiful edifice he constructs, but I don't think it really works so well as some of his other arguments, and certainly not for migration politics. However, where I would agree with you in the way that you're interpreting the double movement is that certainly when you look at migration, it's central to start with the double nature of migration, which is on the one hand, as Savas was emphasizing, and Ulf to some extent in his talk, you have the struggle of ordinary people to improve their lives through migrating. But on the other hand, you have the interests of capital and states in in accumulation and power, moving migrants around the world like pawns and setting up immigration controls and sluices and so on, organizing organizing the movements of people in their own interests. So yeah, certainly the double aspect of it is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also convinced in this. It was thank you, Gareth, for this comment. In the meantime, we got a question in the Q&A from Tamuna, and then what she is asking is the following, and I ask it: do you think that pandemic, when it passes away, and as soon as the transportation network is recovered, will accelerate migration due to the fact that the situation has been worsening in low-income countries? Is it possible that this will push migration to higher-income countries? Or how would such dynamics be met in potential receiving countries, given the rise in nationalism and anti-migrant sentiment? This is a brilliant question, already almost a talk, I would say, but I would like to put it into this. So any of the panelists, could you please react to this? I can give my bet to this, but I would like to ask first you. Yes, Savas, you would like to give a short answer to this. Yes.
It will be very short. Yes, I think that there will be new waves of migration in this transition period in where we are. And I think they will try, and they do, to use nationalism and fascism to stop, to create a control to that. But we have not underestimate the impact of this breakdown process in which we are in the global north itself to the local population. To give one example and I finish. When George Floyd was killed, murdered, and you have this fantastic movement of the Black Lives Matter, this time it was not only the Afro-Americans who were mobilized, but together with them, the Latinos, even the poor whites in the United States. And I think we live in a new situation. It is not just in the period of the crisis we had before, which although it is difficult, although we have the danger of the fascists and the nationalists in front of us, we have more possibilities to create this bond, this solidarity bond, this solidarity without which there will not be emancipation from the barbarism in which we are now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. My immediate reaction would be the following: that of course migration is going to continue, but the contradictions and the tensions around migration are going to be even higher. And we should not forget one thing: those receiving countries, the key thing they would like to achieve is not no migration. What they would like to achieve is even bigger control and even bigger, let's say, how to put it, subordination of migrants, and then to do the cherry picking in a more open way. That would be my immediate reaction to this. But I think the topic is so excellent that I am sure that in the next couple of years, that's going to be a key issue. And maybe next time at that next conference, we are going to do this. In the meantime, I would like to thank all panelists for these excellent talks. Thank you very much for being with us, and hope to see you very soon at other conferences, including our conference, which is going to be mixed economies in anti-capitalist mixed economies. So that's it. You will be duly informed, and thank you very much. And with this, I'm closing the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.